Well, the Phillies aren't saving money on one of their starters. They're going to have to pay him, and it looks like he won't give them any return on their investment. Some news today, Frank Klose from 97.3 ESPN.com with the very latest on the news of Clay Buchholz. Frank, let's start with that before we dive into your mailbag. This week is some news on Clay Buchholz today for the Phillies.
Yeah, it looks like Buchholz underwent surgery with Dr. James Andrews, the famous surgeon who does a lot of these athletes' injuries. So they fixed a torn flexor tendon in his right forearm, and he's out at least 4 to 6 months, which generally means he's not going to pitch again for the Phillies, it looks like.
So overall, I mean, this is the second time or third time, really. They did it with Aaron Harang. They did it with Hellickson. They did it with Charlie Morton. They have tried unsuccessfully, it seems, to bring on these, broken down older guys trying to get a return on investment. They ended up paying all these guys, and I know they have the money to do it, but it doesn't seem that the method is working.
Well, the Phillies, a report came out from Forbes recently that the Phillies made $88 million profit last season, and that's not because they're necessarily trying to be cheap on the payroll. So I think basically they went into this season thinking that they would pick up some one-year salaries of some veterans, which would help them perhaps be viewed a little bit better by the rest of the league, because basically they're trying to get their young guys to develop. They're not trying to be cheap, but, they throw some money at Clay Buchholz. Somebody like Buchholz had interest from other teams like the Marlins. And I guess the Phillies figured, you know what, unlike the Marlins, we can pay the whole salary, so we'll just take a shot at it. And you know what, it didn't work out. And I think the team isn't necessarily worse off than they were before the injury. I mean, I think Zach Eflin, he's ready to go. I think he'll do as well as Buchholz would have done. But a team like the Phillies, whose payroll was next to nothing, if you consider all the money they've added, has just been in one-year players so that they can spend their money for real later when the real players become available. So it was worth a shot. It didn't work out. And, on to the next day.
You mentioned Zach Eflin. He'll take Clay Buchholz's spot in the rotation. Phillies fans might actually like this more, getting a chance to see Eflin all season long rather than Buchholz chewing up those starts. A 23-year-old. He began the season on the DL because of some knee problems. We saw him a little bit last year. But what do you expect from Zach Eflin? People might not remember he was obtained in the Jimmy Rollins deal a couple of years ago, and now here's a guy from that deal who has worked his way to the big leagues. What kind of player, what kind of starter, where do you slot Zach Eflin in the rotation, long-term? What's his long-term outlook for you?
Well, I think he's pitching for his long-term outlook with the Phillies. Somebody like Eflin, actually the surgery he had this offseason was to repair kind of a chronic problem he's had his whole life in his knees, and he says he feels better than ever. And the only reason he was on the disabled list was just the residual recovery time along the way. So the timing kind of worked out for the Phillies. Eflin made his first start after being optioned to the minor leagues the same night that Buchholz got injured. So the timing worked out, and he'll probably come into the rotation. It's hard to say where he profiles long-term. I think he's kind of pitching for that. Is he going to be a number 4 or number 5? That would be where I would put somebody like Eflin at this point. But he's got, a lot of guys, he's got to show what he can do. And it's kind of good for him that he's getting this opportunity right now, because probably what was going to happen this year is that Eflin is going to be the guy who comes up when somebody gets hurt. Unfortunately, it was the veteran that the Phillies got for depth, so they wouldn't have to worry about injuries as much. But Eflin's going to get his chance, and unlike last year, I think he's more prepared for the major leagues. And if you remember last year, he just got absolutely lit up his first 2 starts. But he did settle in nicely along the way. I got to see him pitch a complete game shutout in Pittsburgh last season. So I think coming into this year, he'll be more confident. He'll be more polished. If that knee issue really is solved long term, I think he'll be a lot more comfortable, when you consider how much a pitcher uses his legs. So Eflin's in a good position to show that he belongs. And the only downside is then you have to start thinking about who's going to be the next to come up in case of injury or trade to take another start. And so far, Jake Thompson and Mark Appel have kind of struggled at AAA, and Nick Pavetta's been pitching very well. So we'll see what happens next. But at least for now, if nobody gets hurt, the rotation's probably just as good as it was with Buchholz there.
Frank Klose is with us. The mailbag is open, and Frank Van wants to know about Sunday's game. He says and writes, Sunday's game, are we playing to win or it doesn't matter the result? Why would you challenge Bryce Harper, walk him, and create a force at every bag?
Well, in defense of the Phillies pitching to him, behind Bryce Harper is somebody who's not exactly too shabby either, in Daniel Murphy, who's been tearing the cover off the ball. So I don't think that – I don't necessarily fault the Phillies for trying to pitch him at that point. Benoit had some pretty nasty stuff that day. He was hitting as high as 97 on the radar gun, which is pretty impressive for a 39-year-old. So I think what ended up happening in the end was he got ahead 0-2, and he just thought that he could take care of the inexperienced youth of Bryce Harper and get him to chase something, but Harper didn't. And then finally, when the count went full, he had to throw something in the zone, and Harper just crushed it. So, you got to give some credit to Harper there. But yeah, I think the whole situation bears taking a deep breath and a pause and trying to figure out the plan long term. I've spoken in the past. You don't want to put Neris in that closer position and sort of give the impression he's your long-term answer, just because you never know what's going to happen. We've spoken about Velasquez being a closer down the line. You don't know who is out in the free agent market, or the Phillies may be willing to pony up for somebody like Zach Britton when he becomes available. So I think through this year they want to see what kind of talent they have from their relievers, not so much who's going to be the long-term answer yet. They don't want to make that decision. So Benoit is as good as anybody to close from the veteran side of things. I mean, I saw some people suggesting they go to Pat Neshek. Well, guess what? Neshek has a 0 ERA, but so did Benoit before that inning. So I don't want to make too big a deal out of that outing. And you consider, at the end of the day, did Benoit pitching in that ninth inning really affect the Phillies long-term? And the answer to that is really no. You didn't think the Phillies were going to make the playoffs this year. Now, you hate to see somebody like Eichhoff, who pitched decently. You see his start kind of go to waste, even though he wasn't in line for the win. So those types of things you don't want to do. But really, this was Benoit's first time giving up runs all season. I wouldn't worry about it that much. You're not that worried about this season. And that long-term closer is a question for another day. So I wouldn't worry about this too much, even though you do want to win every game you possibly can.
Frank, another question comes from Joseph. He wants to know, with all the issues at closer, should the Phillies have kept Ken Giles?
Yeah, it's a pretty funny question to ask, because if you look at Ken Giles' performance, if he was on the Phillies pitching as he pitched for the Houston Astros last year and this year, he would just be leaving the Phillies with the same question marks that he might have right now. Giles, he actually pitched to a 9 ERA last April, and that was enough for him to lose his closer's job. And, he kind of got it together in the middle of the season. I think he had a 0 ERA in July, pitched well in June, pitched well in August, but then September he just blew up all over again. So if you're the Phillies and you see this guy blow up to start the season and to close the season, you're not necessarily probably really convinced he's your long-term answer. And so far this season, as of when the question got asked, Giles had a 9 ERA this year, to the point where Astros manager and former Philly A.J. Hinch, he actually pitched Giles in the 8th inning, not the 9th inning, and he actually gave the save opportunity to Luke Gregerson. So Houston, while they're saying that Giles will pitch most of, and I'm quoting A.J. Hinch there, most of the 9th inning opportunities, they're really not committing to him as closer. So if you're worried about having your closer question answered, having Ken Giles here wouldn't necessarily answer that question for you. Now, the other hand, you also want to consider what the Phillies got in return. And now they did give away Jonathan Aruz, who is currently serving a system. But they got back Vince Velasquez, who I think, even though we talk about where he's going to fit long term, we all agree that he's got a really electric arm. And even at the time of the Giles trade, some of the scouts were saying that Vince Velasquez might be just as good as Ken Giles if they used him as a reliever. So there's that, and that doesn't even take into account some of the other players in the trade. Now, I'm not too impressed with Mark Appel this season. I mean, I did see him pitch once, but in his other starts, he hasn't done well. But they also have Tom Meshelman pitching at Double-A Reading, who remains a prospect for the Phillies, and Harold Aruz, no relation to Jonathan, who they traded. He's pitching okay as a reliever in the Philly system right now. So they got a lot back. And you know what? Even though the likes of Brett Oberholzer already came and went, they weren't really. He wasn't really a big piece of that trade anyway. The Phillies get a real gem in Vince Velasquez, and it was very, very much worth it to them because they're going to have that Velasquez longer than the Astros have Ken Giles, and at the same time, you don't really know what you have with Ken Giles. So keeping Giles around doesn't necessarily answer your closer question.
All right, Frank Klose with us here. You got a plethora of questions from Chris and Ron and Mike. They all have questions regarding the middle infield, and Cesar Hernandez seems to come up in that a lot. It seems that, nobody's buying Cesar Hernandez as a guy that, hey, maybe he's a guy that we should like and maybe keep and maybe be happy that he's on the team. But what do you see his long-term future is kind of the gist of a lot of these questions regarding the middle infielders.
Yeah, I think the thing with Hernandez is I was always really, really high on Cesar Hernandez. And then, early last season, he kind of gave me a little bit of doubts. And I think for a lot of Phillies fans, that was the first time they really got to see Hernandez. And, it took them a while to really see kind of the tools that he actually has. I mean, you consider all the way back in 2013, that was when he got his first chance with the Phillies, and they had to throw him in center field. And that's clearly not ideal for somebody like him with his talent. So really, this is only year 2 of Hernandez being Chase Utley free and being blocked, and finally they can actually get a look at him. So I think fans are getting on board with Hernandez. I think they really like the tools he offers. I think they really like what he can do for a team. I think they're also equally excited about the likes of Scott Kingery and Jesmuel Valentin that are in the system. So right now they're starting to think, there's a lot of depth here. And if you noticed, in the offseason, there were a few reports out there that the Phillies might be willing to move Hernandez in a trade.
Right.
I think they were trying to maybe consider selling high on him like they considered Ken Giles, and they actually made a deal, So, you saw the prices people were getting for the likes of Adam Eaton last offseason in trade, which was a lot. A player like Hernandez who can get on base, there's not a lot of guys that get on base anymore. I mean, it seems like the high on base percentage guys are a thing of the past. So Hernandez is somebody that could potentially interest a contender. Now, the Phillies might listen because, one, they have 2 prospects in the system, and they also have Howie Kendrick hanging around, and they could plug him there for now. But I think the Phillies are very high on Scott Kingery. He's only played second base. One question was, would they move him to shortstop? I don't think he really profiles as a shortstop. I wouldn't do that, but they could consider a position change if they decide that Hernandez is going to be a long-term part of their future. Jesmuel Valentin, he can play a couple other positions in the infield. He might be a guy that's a super utility player in the end. If you look at both of those 2 prospects, Kingery's hit 4 home runs already, which is pretty impressive in 10 games. And Valentin, he's hitting 355. So they're very different types of bats, and both of them are going to hopefully keep it up. But let's remember, Dominic Brown, he raked AAA, and he never really made it as a major leaguer. So you really need to kind of see what the end of the story is for all these prospects. I mean, it could be that the Phillies are willing to trade one at some point. Matt Klentak, general manager, sort of indicated that the Phillies were going to be ready to spend big at some point, whether it's taking on somebody else's superstar contract or perhaps signing some as a free agent. So there's still a lot to work itself out. So it's nice to have that depth, but at some point, hopefully, one of them is a AAA kind of telling the Phillies with their play, you have to bring me up. And then at that point, you just kind of see what's going on. I mean, you might decide you like Hernandez. And one thing about Hernandez, the Phillies signed him when he was 16 years old. So if it feels like he's been around forever, he pretty much has been around forever, but he's really not that old. So he's a piece that the Phillies could use long term if they really feel they have something. So there's lots of options. I don't think anything necessitates any action right now. Even J.P. Crawford playing pretty poorly at the plate at AAA. So there's still time to work these things out. So I think the Phillies are very happy to have all these assets, but they don't really feel compelled to do anything just yet.
All right, good stuff from Frank. If you have a question for next week's mailbag, at Frank Klose on Twitter. That's Frank Klose with a K. And we'll have the Phillies mailbag for you every Tuesday right here on the Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN. Phillies and Mets, a couple of Zacks, Eflin and Wheeler, go at it tonight on Citizens Bank Park, the oldest ballpark in the National League. I'm going to keep going with that one, PT.
Which one will be saved by the bell? Because Zach.
One's with a K, one's with an H. Figure that one out.
Minor technicality.
Hey, Frank, good stuff, pal. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.